I have been angry for about 3 months now. Not the sort of anger that burns off by evening and leaves you calmer for having felt it. A colder sort. The kind that does not go away even after you have found the answer to the question that started it. And the question that started it was almost embarrassingly small. One word: hell. Possibly the most terrifying word most of us ever learned as children. A place of fire that never runs out of things to burn. Eternal, conscious torment, reserved for anyone who arrived at the wrong answer to a question they were rarely allowed to ask twice. I was frightened of it myself from around the age of 6, and I still remember the specific texture of that fear, lying awake in the dark, trying and failing to picture forever. The way a child's mind simply bounces off a concept that large and comes back bruised. That single word did an extraordinary amount of work in Western civilization for the better part of 1600 years. It kept people in pews. It kept people silent when they should have spoken. It kept people obedient, confessing, paying, terrified of a fire they were assured was waiting the moment their certainty ran out. And Jesus never said it. Not once. Let me say that again. Because the first time it lands wrong, like a typographical error, like something you assume will correct itself once you read the footnote properly. Jesus never once said the word hell. Not in Aramaic, the language he actually spoke, because the word simply does not exist there. Not in the Hebrew he would have heard read aloud in the synagogue, because it does not exist there either. Not even in the Greek the Gospels were eventually written down in, because that word does not exist in that language. What he actually said. On the 11 separate occasions the Synoptic Gospels record him warning people about fire and judgment was a specific Greek word. That word was Geenna. And Geenna was not a metaphysical dimension outside of space and time. It was not a subterranean torture chamber staffed by demons with pitchforks. It was a place with a name, a place with coordinates, a valley you could walk to on a Tuesday afternoon. I need to be honest about how I got here, because if I am not, none of what follows will mean anything. There is a way of reading old texts that I inherited a long time ago from a philosopher who was expelled from his own community for using it. Read the text as it actually stands, not as centuries of comfortable tradition have smoothed it into being, not softened by whoever happens to be delivering the sermon that particular Sunday, as it is written in the order the words appear, in the language they were first written in. It sounds almost too simple to cause trouble. It got that philosopher thrown out of his synagogue at the age of 23, and it is the only method I actually trust when a word this loaded is sitting in front of me, because nearly everything else people use to explain a word like hell turns out, on close inspection, to be a way of not reading it. His name was Spinoza. And I have spent something like 20 years now reading him the way other people return to a well they trust even when they are not thirsty. Not because he wrote about Gehenna specifically, he never did, but because the question he kept asking about Scripture is exactly the question I found myself asking about this word. Who benefits from the way this text is currently being read? And who benefited 400 years after the fact from readers no longer being able to check? So let me apply that method properly, because I think you deserve the whole trail in the order I actually found it, rather than the tidy version where I already knew where I was going. Here is what I believed for most of my life, the same as nearly everyone I have ever spoken to about this. Hell is simply a Christian idea. Ancient, coherent, always meant exactly what it currently means. A fixed point in the theological sky that has not moved since the crucifixion. Fire, judgment, eternity, all bolted together from the very beginning as a single indivisible doctrine, taught by Jesus himself in more or less the terms your grandmother's Bible teaches it. I never once questioned that assumption because it never occurred to me that there was anything underneath it to question. The word felt bedrock, foundational. The kind of thing you build a civilization's entire moral architecture on top of without ever checking whether the foundation is actually load-bearing. But something had been quietly nagging at me for longer than I would like to admit. A small, persistent itch, the kind you eventually have to scratch or lose your mind. If Jesus was a first-century rabbi, teaching almost exclusively in Aramaic to almost exclusively Jewish audiences in Galilee and Judea, why does the Christian hell look nothing whatsoever like anything from his own culture? No fire pits in the Hebrew scriptures he would have grown up reciting. No eternal conscious torment as a fixed doctrine anywhere in the Jewish thought of his period. Where, precisely, did all of that imagery actually come from, if not from him? That question would not leave me alone. I needed to know, not in the mild, curious way you want to know a piece of trivia, but in the specific, compulsive way that keeps you awake past midnight with a lamp on and a stack of texts you have already read twice. Because if the answer was what I suspected, it meant something rather large had happened to that word on its way into my own language, and I would not be able to unknow it once I had it in front of me. So I decided to actually go and look. Not at commentaries about the word, not at what preachers have said the word means for the last several centuries. At the word itself, in the earliest texts we actually possess before a single translator had touched it, and that is where everything I thought I understood started to come apart. The first thing you notice, the moment you stop reading English translations and start reading the underlying text, is that there is not one word for the afterlife in the Bible. There are four completely distinct words describing four completely distinct things. And at some point in history, somebody decided to flatten all four of them into a single English term. The first is Sheol. This is the Hebrew word, and it is the oldest of the four. Sheol is not a place of punishment at all. It is simply the grave, the shadowy realm where absolutely everyone goes after death, the righteous and the wicked without distinction, neutral, quiet, almost indifferent. If you read the Psalms in their original Hebrew, Sheol sounds less like a threat and more like a fact of biology. The second is Hades. This is the Greek equivalent of Sheol, used throughout the Greek Old Testament and carried directly into the New Testament. Also a holding place for the dead in general, not a torture chamber for sinners in particular. Borrowed quite openly from Greek mythology, the way any culture borrows the nearest available concept when translating an idea that does not map perfectly onto its neighbor's language. The third is Tartarus. This one appears exactly once in the entire New Testament, in the second epistle of Peter, and it refers specifically to a prison for fallen angels, not to human souls at all. It is a piece of borrowed Greek mythological architecture used for one very narrow purpose, and never generalized into a doctrine about where ordinary people go when they die. And the fourth is Gehenna. And Gehenna is the one Jesus actually used every single time. I want to sit with that for a moment because the first time I laid all four of these side by side, something in my chest genuinely tightened. Four distinct words, four distinct concepts, four entirely different functions within the text, and modern English translations for the most part take all four of them and pour them into a single vessel, hell, as though a term for the neutral grave, a term borrowed from Greek myth for the general dead, a term for an angelic prison, and the actual name of an actual valley outside an actual city were all somehow interchangeable. They are not interchangeable. They never were. Let me read you the specific passage that stopped me cold, because I think you need to see it in something close to its original shape before I explain what it is pointing at. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says this: "If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into Geenna." Not hell. Geenna. That is the actual word sitting underneath your English translation. And he does not say it once in passing as a throwaway threat. He repeats variations of it across Matthew, across Mark, in the Sermon on the Mount, in his warnings to the religious authorities, in his private teaching to his own disciples. 11 times. Always the same word. Never once anything resembling the English term hell. So the obvious question becomes, what on earth was Geenna? What was he actually pointing at? To answer that, you have to go back roughly 600 years before Jesus was ever born to the Hebrew scriptures themselves, specifically the books of Jeremiah and 2 Kings. There, we learn that the Valley of Hinnom, Ge-Hinnom in Hebrew, the direct linguistic ancestor of the Greek word Geenna, was the site of something called Topheth. And Topheth was where certain kings of Judah, in their darkest political and religious crises, sacrificed their own children by fire to a foreign deity associated with the name Molech. Jeremiah records the horror of this directly, in language that still has teeth after 2,500 years. They have built the high places of Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and daughters in the fire, something I did not command, nor did it enter my mind. Read that again slowly. This is not poetic exaggeration. This is a specific place with a specific name where a specific and unspeakable atrocity actually happened, recorded by a prophet who could barely contain his own horror as he wrote it down. Because of that history, King Josiah, one of the great reforming kings of Judah, deliberately desecrated the valley so that it could never again be used for that purpose. The account in 2 Kings is almost clinical in its precision. He defiled Topheth so that no one could use it to sacrifice their son or daughter in the fire to Molech. Defiled, deliberately, permanently, he turned the valley into the single most ritually unclean piece of ground in the entire region, precisely so that its former use would become unthinkable. By the time Jesus was teaching, some 6 centuries later, Gehenna was not an active site of ritual killing any longer. It was something else. It was the city's rejected space, the place where refuse ended up, the permanent symbol in the collective memory of everyone living in and around Jerusalem of what happens when the powerful sacrifice the innocent to protect their own position. A place with a name every single person in his audience already knew, walked past, understood without needing a single word of explanation. This is where I have to be honest with you about something, because it would be dishonest to leave it out simply because it complicates the picture. There is a popular claim, repeated in a great many sermons and a great many documentaries, that Gehenna was, in Jesus' own lifetime, a literal smoldering rubbish dump, burning day and night just outside the city walls. I want to tell you that claim is airtight. I cannot. The earliest surviving source for that specific detail, the burning municipal rubbish heap, comes from a medieval rabbi named David Kimchi, writing around 1200 years after Jesus, not from anyone in the 1st century. Careful archaeologists and historians of the region have pointed out correctly that we do not actually have 1st century literary or archaeological evidence confirming an active burning rubbish tip in that exact valley during Jesus' lifetime. I nearly stopped researching entirely when I found that. It felt for about an hour like the whole architecture I had been building was about to collapse under its own foundation. If the burning rubbish heap detail was a later medieval embellishment, was the entire case simply another comforting story, dressed up to look like scholarship? But sitting with that discomfort, rather than running from it, I realized the burning rubbish heap was never actually the load-bearing part of the claim. What is not remotely in dispute, what sits in the primary sources themselves, is this. The valley was real. It had a name and a fixed location on a map that has not moved in 2,500 years. It carried a documented history of the worst possible defilement, child sacrifice, followed by deliberate permanent desecration by royal decree. And Jesus used its name specifically, deliberately, 11 separate times, never once reaching for the more generic Hades or the more mythological Tartarus. Whatever the precise physical state of that valley in the 1st century, it was not an abstraction. It had an address, a history, and a reputation, all of which Jesus was clearly leaning on. I want to address something directly here because I know exactly what the more skeptical among you are already forming as an objection, and I would rather meet it head on than pretend it does not exist. Someone will say, Jesus was obviously using Gehenna as a metaphor for divine judgment. Everyone with any theological training already knows that the physical valley was simply the symbol he reached for. And on the surface, that sounds like a reasonable rebuttal. Except a metaphor only carries force if the audience actually understands what it is pointing at. Jesus' listeners knew Ge-Hinnom. Some of them had walked past its edge on the way into the city that same week. The metaphor worked precisely because the referent was real, familiar, and soaked in a very specific kind of dread. The moment you translate Gehenna into a word with no geography attached to it whatsoever, the metaphor does not survive the journey. What remains is only the fear, floating completely free of the place that gave it meaning in the first place. The metaphor became a doctrine unto itself. That is not translation. That is substitution, and I think the difference matters enormously. So then the actual question becomes urgent. How does a real valley with a real name, sitting on a real map outside a real city, become the English word hell? How do you get from Ge-Hinnom to an eternal subterranean torture chamber? This is where the story stops being merely interesting and starts becoming, to me at least, genuinely disturbing. Because it is not really a story about language drifting slowly and naturally over centuries. It is a story about specific decisions made by specific people at specific moments, each one collapsing distinctions that the original texts had gone to real trouble to keep separate. The first collapse happens around the year 400 of the Common Era with a scholar named Jerome. Pope Damasus I commissioned Jerome to translate the Hebrew and Greek scriptures into Latin, a translation that would eventually become known as the Vulgate and would remain the standard text of Western Christianity for well over 1,000 years. And Jerome, working through those 4 completely distinct terms I described earlier, Sheol, Hades, Tartarus, and Gehenna, made a decision. He collapsed all 4 of them into a single Latin word. Infernus, literally, the place beneath. In that one act of translation, the specific geography of Gehenna simply vanished. The historical memory of a physical valley south of Jerusalem with its own name and its own documented history was absorbed into a generic Latin underworld with no coordinates at all. The neutral grave of Sheol, the general afterlife of Hades, the narrow angelic prison of Tartarus, and the real, physical, historically specific valley of Gehenna were all poured into the same word. 4 distinct concepts, doing 4 distinct kinds of work in the original texts, became one undifferentiated abyss. I sat with that for a long time before I could move on to the next part of the trail, because I wanted to be fair to Jerome. He was translating an enormous body of ancient text across 2 languages into a third, under commission from the most powerful religious authority in the Western world, without the linguistic and archaeological tools we now take for granted. Some simplification was probably inevitable, but inevitable is not the same as innocent, and what happened next made the stakes of that particular simplification considerably clearer. Centuries after Jerome, Christian missionaries carried the gospel, and Jerome's Latin infernus along with it, into Germanic-speaking Europe. And when they needed a local word their new converts would actually understand, they reached for the nearest available term already sitting in the language. They reached for the Old English word hell. Now follow that word backward, because this is the part that genuinely unsettled me more than anything else in the entire trail. Hell derives from the Proto-Germanic root haljō, which meant roughly a concealed or hidden place. That same root gives us the Old Norse figure Hel, not a place, initially, a person. Hel was the Norse goddess of the underworld, daughter of Loki, ruler of a cold, gray, shadowy realm reserved for those who did not die in battle. Nothing about fire. Nothing about eternal conscious torment. A quiet, dim, wintry place, ruled by a pagan death goddess whose name we still carry, completely unchanged inside our English Bibles. Let that actually sit for a moment, because I do not think it lands properly the first time you hear it. The word your grandmother read in her King James Bible, the word that has terrified children for centuries, the word the entire architecture of eternal conscious torment is quite literally built out of, is the name of a Norse pagan death goddess. Missionaries took a name belonging to Loki's daughter, laid it directly over a Latin translation of an Aramaic-speaking rabbi who was actually gesturing at a valley just outside Jerusalem. And generations later, that layering was preached from pulpits as the unaltered, infallible Word of God. Over the following centuries, theologians then grafted the fire and brimstone imagery originally associated with the Valley of Gehenna onto this borrowed Norse vessel, producing a hybrid concept that the actual historical Jesus, teaching in 1st century Galilee, would very likely not have recognized at all. I want to bring in one voice here because I think it matters that this is not simply my own private theory, assembled from scattered fragments at 2 in the morning. The New Testament scholar Nicholas Thomas Wright, in his book Surprised by Hope, describes Gehenna in almost identical terms. Jerusalem's smoldering rubbish heap, he calls it, and then some metaphor for the place of fiery judgment after death, placing it specifically outside the southwest corner of the old city. Wright is about as credentialed as it is possible to be in this field, a former bishop, a professor of New Testament studies, and even scholars who dispute the specific rubbish heap detail generally accept his core point without argument. Gehenna referred to an actual locatable place, not a metaphysical abstraction, a place with a name, on a map, that Jesus' own listeners could have walked to that same afternoon. I nearly abandoned this whole line of research at exactly this point, and I want to be honest with you about why. Because I think the reason matters more than the fact itself. It was late. I had been at this for weeks by then, cross-referencing 4 ancient languages I only partially trust myself to read without help, and I kept hitting the same objection from my own internal skeptic. So what? Words drift. Every language borrows, every translator simplifies, every religious tradition inherits vocabulary from whatever culture happened to be standing nearest when the conversion took place. Perhaps this was simply what languages do, and I was building an entire conspiracy out of ordinary linguistic entropy. I very nearly closed the books that night and let the whole question go. But then, I made myself actually finish the counting. Because if this really was just ordinary drift, the pattern should look random. It should not have a direction. And it did not look random at all. Every single step in that chain moved the concept further away from anything that could be checked, verified, or walked to. Sheol, Hades, Tartarus, and Gehenna, 4 terms you could in principle investigate, 3 of them tied to actual bodies of thought, and 1 of them tied to an actual valley with an actual boundary, collapsed into infernus, a generic Latin abstraction with no fixed location at all. Infernus was then handed a local name, Hell, borrowed from a mythology already built around an underworld nobody could visit either. Every single translation choice moved the destination further from anywhere a skeptical listener could go and check for themselves. That is not the shape random drift takes. That is the shape erasure takes. One careful step at a time, each step defensible on its own, until the destination is somewhere entirely outside space and time, unfalsifiable by design. I want to answer one more objection before I move past this, because I know it is coming, and I would rather earn the conclusion than assert it. Someone will say the doctrine of eternal damnation does not rest on a single word. It rests on the entire corpus of Scripture, an enormous accumulated tradition far larger than one Greek term. And in a narrow sense, that is true. But when preachers reach for their proof text, when they quote Jesus' warning that God can destroy both soul and body in Gehenna, they are quoting a Greek sentence containing the actual name of a valley south of Jerusalem, a valley you could locate on a map today. The architecture of eternal conscious torment leans again and again on roughly a dozen specific Gehenna passages. Trace every single one of those passages back to its Greek word, trace that word back to its Hebrew geography, and you arrive, every time, at the same address, just outside the old city walls. So how did a warning about a real valley, rooted in a real historical atrocity and a real royal desecration, end up becoming a threat about a place entirely outside space and time? I think the answer is the part that actually made me angry, and it is the part I keep returning to whenever I think this has finally stopped bothering me. A threat you can verify has limits. You can walk to the Valley of Hinnom. You can stand at its edge and see with your own eyes that it is a valley, not a doorway into eternal fire. A threat like that has to earn its power honestly, through the weight of what it actually represents. Historical trauma, moral seriousness, the real cost of a society sacrificing its own children to appease the anxieties of the powerful. A threat outside space and time has no such limits. It cannot be walked to. It cannot be inspected. It can only be described by whoever currently holds the authority to describe it, and believed by whoever currently lacks the means to check. Move the coordinates from a named valley to an unlocatable metaphysical realm, and you have not simply translated a word. You have transferred the entire authority for verifying the threat away from the person being threatened and handed it permanently to whoever stands at the pulpit. There is a philosopher I keep coming back to whenever I notice a pattern like this, the same one I mentioned earlier, and I am not going to pretend his name is incidental to why I went looking for this trail in the first place. He spent a great deal of his working life arguing that fear, specifically fear of unseen and unverifiable punishment, is the primary mechanism by which religious and political authority keeps ordinary people obedient. He was writing about 17th century Amsterdam, not 1st century Jerusalem, and he never once mentioned Gehenna by name. But the mechanism he was describing is exactly what I found sitting underneath this word, once I finally traced it all the way back. You do not need a population to believe something is true. You only need them to be unable to check. I would like to tell you I am now simply satisfied that I have closed the file and moved on to something less unsettling. I am not. I would honestly rather not know this. Not because the fact itself is monstrous, because you do not put a fact like this back once you have taken it out. You do not unsee it. You learn instead to carry it. Before this, I could roll my eyes at a street preacher holding a sign about eternal fire and simply keep walking, mildly amused, entirely unbothered. I cannot do that any longer. Now, whenever I hear anyone, in any pulpit, in any context, leaning on the threat of eternal conscious torment to move a congregation toward obedience or silence or a particular vote or a particular donation, I do not hear theology anymore. I hear a 4th century Latin translation choice, wearing a Norse death goddess's borrowed name, still doing exactly the job it was quietly repurposed to do 1600 years ago. I cannot unhear that. I have tried. This is, I think, the actual cost of doing this kind of work honestly. Not that you end up believing nothing. I still find enormous moral seriousness in the original warning, the real one, about what human beings do to each other when the powerful sacrifice the vulnerable to protect themselves. What I have lost is the ability to hear the borrowed version, the eternal fire outside space and time, without immediately hearing the mechanism underneath it. That particular kind of certainty does not come back once you have traced its supply chain. I said right at the beginning of all this that I was angry and that the anger had not gone away even once I had my answer. I want to come back to that now because I think I described it wrongly the first time. I was angry at the wrong target for a long while. I spent weeks quietly furious at Jerome, at the Germanic missionaries, at the King James translators 300 years further down the line, as though each of them had sat down one morning and deliberately chosen to frighten children for the next millennium and a half. I do not actually believe that any longer. They were, by and large, working men of their own centuries, reaching for the tools and the vocabulary they actually had, translating an enormous and difficult body of ancient text across languages they were often working at the very edge of their own competence in. I have made my own share of smaller errors doing far less difficult work than that. What I am actually angry at now is something quieter and considerably harder to aim at a single historical villain. It is how badly we still, collectively, want the abstract version to remain true, long after the linguistic evidence for the specific version is sitting in plain sight in every serious Bible dictionary published in the last century. Because the abstract hell asks almost nothing of you in the present. If eternal punishment is a metaphysical destination reserved for the wrong belief or the wrong prayer, then the entire moral weight of the doctrine collapses into private, internal, unverifiable compliance. Believe correctly, and you are safe. Nothing about how you actually treat the people standing next to you is required by the abstraction at all. But if Gehenna was real, if it was a specific place where the powerful once sacrificed the innocent to manage their own fear and was then permanently desecrated as a monument to that specific horror, then Jesus was not describing anywhere you go after you die. He was describing somewhere you build right now, every single time a society chooses to sacrifice its most vulnerable members to protect the anxieties of whoever currently holds power. Look at what you are doing to each other, he was saying. Keep choosing this, and you will manufacture Gehenna yourselves, here, in this life, without any assistance from the next one at all. I cannot read those 11 passages the same way anymore. Every single time I come across a Gehenna reference now, I hear the valley first, the smoke and the history and the specific documented atrocity underneath it, and only afterwards, faintly, underneath all of that, the borrowed Norse goddess wearing it like a mask. I entered this whole line of inquiry wanting to know why one particular word had been mistranslated. I came out the other side understanding that the mistranslation was never simply an accident. It was exactly what the resulting system required in order to keep functioning the way it needed to function. We traded a genuinely serious moral warning about human cruelty for a mythological terror engineered to guarantee obedience. And I think that trade, more than the fire itself, is the actual tragedy sitting underneath this word. If this kind of forensic tracing through the original texts is the sort of thing that brought you to this channel in the first place, I have put together a complete archive of work exactly like this. 5 volumes tracing the layers underneath a number of doctrines we were simply handed without ever being shown the receipts. You will find it linked in the comment pinned below this video, alongside the specific sources I have referenced tonight, if you would like to check any of this yourself, rather than taking my word for it. That checking is honestly the entire point. Before you go, one last thought, and then I will let you get on with your evening. This channel exists for precisely this kind of conversation. The sort we rarely have out loud. The sort that quietly dismantles something we assumed was simply bedrock. If tonight's journey through this word made sense to you, hitting subscribe tells the algorithm you would like more of exactly this. Because I have a great many more of these trails that refuse to let go of me until I have followed them all the way to the end. Does knowing where this specific word actually came from change how you hear it? Or do you think the borrowed vocabulary genuinely does not matter once the doctrine has settled in for 1600 years regardless? I am honestly not certain I have settled that question myself. Tell me where you land in the comments.
In 2012, I spent 2 weeks in the Vatican archives. What I saw there, they never let anyone publish. Spinoza was right about everything. And I'm going to show you the evidence they don't want you to see.